The alpha stage in League of Legends is something of a mystery. It's not like all the footage has been suspiciously scrubbed from the internet or anything, it's just more so that the game is so old that when it was in the alpha stage, people's PCs weren't really even capable of recording. I've been thinking a lot about old League lately, if you couldn't tell, so I just thought I'm gonna make a whole video on these items, most of which were, to be honest, completely insane and broken. So either this video is gonna be nostalgic for you, or you're gonna learn something new. Also, a big thank you to the League of Legends wiki and anyone who's ever archived any information there. This video wouldn't have been possible without them. A lot of the items were just cheaper generally, like boots were only 250 gold and Rejuvenation Bead was 185 gold instead of 300. There were a lot of small items like Sash of Valor, which was an 80 gold item that added 3 damage and 50 health, Belt of Brute Strength, which gave 9 damage and 150 health, and Clever Hoop and Sage's Ring, which seemed like the early prototypes for Doran's Ring. The former gave 4 spell damage and 30 mana for only 80 gold, while the latter gave 12 spell damage and 120 mana for 500 gold. You might notice that for a lot of these items that we're about to talk about, the stat names like attack damage and ability power haven't even been invented yet, they've just referred to them as damage and spell damage instead. 30% increased attack rate, 150 mana, and 5% chance on attack for the next spell within 10 seconds to be completely free. Funnily enough, the item's icon was actually the old Archangel staff. The actual Archangel staff gave 240 mana, 32 spell damage, 150 hit points, 3 mana regen per second, but it had a crazy active where you would cast an Apocalypse that dealt 400 damage in 150 AoE. What's more, this damage could also damage yourself. If you're thinking, hey, does this mean that you could literally kill yourself in old League of Legends? And honestly, from reading the item, it looks that way. The icon for it was also what eventually became the icon for the old Deathfire Grasp. There was another item that was literally called Bastard Sword. It cost 1150 gold and gave 28 attack damage and 5% increased critical strike chance. If you wanted to recall, you could buy the blue pill. After using it, you'd channel for 4 seconds and return to base. If you wanted to teleport somewhere else on the map, you could pick up a scroll of teleport for 80 gold, and using it would teleport you to a friendly structure on the map after a 4-second channel. A lot of things like summoner spells and recalls and all of that used to just be attached to items, which we'll dive into more as we go through the video. Throughout your time playing League, you've almost certainly at some point leveled up the wrong ability, and if you haven't, luckily for you, if you have done this, in the shop there's an item called Tome of Retraining, and for only 400 gold you can get the ability to re-spend your skill points. Of course, there also used to be health potions, and also mana potions, but the big difference at these old greater potions restored resources instantly, with the greater healing potion giving 450 health and the greater mana potion giving 300 mana. But even the more typical healing potion was still a lot beefier. Regeneration Potion would set you back 45 gold, which is less than a regular health pot these days, but it would restore 2.5 times more health. What's more, while this potion was active, you would dispel any damage taken. Really makes you wonder how anyone got kills in this version of the game. Flask of Crystal Water was the mana equivalent to this. It restored 120 mana over 15 seconds, but also dispelled any damage taken. If you're looking at all of this and thinking, maybe I need some items to help do some damage, then how about you just buy a grenade? Loosely Packed Grenade was an actual item that was in the game, and it was an active. You could lob the grenade and any unit caught in the AoE would take 200 damage. If you're looking for something a little bit more old school, then maybe you'd be interested in Knife. It doesn't actually do any damage though, it just makes you faster by 5 movement speed. They're also stackable, so if you really wanted to, you could get 6 Knife. A slightly bigger item is
Strygwyrs.
It adds 32 damage, 40% increased attack rate, 9% crit, and a 10% chance on hit to leave a debuff that deals damage to the unit every 0.1 seconds. It also seems to increase by 0.8 damage per 1 distance move since the last check, and if there is a cap on this, it is not mentioned in the item description. Doppleganker was a 1280 gold item that gave 25 damage, 260 health, and 7 charges of Doppelwalk, which turns your hero invisible and leaves a clone that dealt 50% of your damage and took an additional 50% damage at the same location. These clones would last 20 seconds, they cost 0 mana and had a 30-second cooldown, and it's unknown what this item built out of or whether you could control clones back in this stage of the game. You also might have noticed that in the item description your character is referred to as a hero. It's pretty likely that Riot decided on the term champion later down the line, and hero is just taken straight from Dota, as a lot of the game was at the time. As you'll see later, some items have icons that are just straight up ripped out of Dota, which is pretty funny. Another mechanic that didn't make it to the final version of the game is mentioned in the item Duskbringer. It added 6 damage, 15% attack rate, and a 12% increase to movement speed at night, and a 100% chance on hit at night to deal 20 additional damage and gain 20 life. As you might have guessed, this mechanic isn't actually based in real life, otherwise I'm sure you can imagine how OP finished players would be. We can take a look at Dota 2 to get some idea of how this worked, because in that game there actually is a day and night cycle, and certain mechanics behave differently depending on the time of day. Each day lasts 10 minutes or so, and every 5 minutes the game will cycle between day and night. This system was probably pretty similar in the pre-alpha version of League, but it's hard to find any concrete details. Flamewalkers were a type of boot that you could buy for 1250 gold. On top of the regular 40 movement speed, you'd also receive 30 spell damage and an activatable fire trail that leaves a flaming wake behind the caster where he walks for 10 seconds. This active did cost you 150 mana though, but it only had a 40-second cooldown and it dealt a whopping 150 damage per second. Leeroys Charge was a 2200 gold item that added 40 damage, 5% crit strike, 15% life steal, and it had an activatable called Leeroy that increased crit strike by 25% and movement speed by 10% for 10 seconds, but you can't control your character during this time. Obviously this item was pretty inspired by this World of Warcraft clip.
Alright, chums up. Ready, guys? Let's do this. Leeroy Dragons!
However, I honestly find it more interesting that this item has pretty big parallels with Briar, a champion that was released in 2023, and it makes me wonder if the item was ever referenced during her development. As you may have already noticed, a lot of the items in pre-alpha had their icons switched around. Like if you look at this icon, it's pretty clearly been recolored and reused for the early version of Lichbane. But this item in particular is actually called Sheen and Phage. Its cost is unknown, as is its build path, but I think at least with the build path we can make a pretty good guess. Obviously, it builds out of Knife. It gave 250 hit points, 20 damage, 150 mana, 20 spell damage, and whenever the bearer casts a spell, he's healed for 20% of the spell's mana cost, and it has a 10% chance on hit to hamstring the target, reducing its armor by 5 and movement speed by 35%. Spike the Ripper was an item that, again, had an unknown price and build path. It added 35 damage, 300 health, and had 5 charges of Gash. Gash would slow a target enemy's movement speed by 55% for 4 seconds. It cost 0 mana and had a 15-second cooldown. 5 charges of something that lasts for 4 seconds and has a 15-second cooldown seems like you could just use it infinitely without stopping. Items like this and Doppleganker and Flamewalkers seem pretty stacked looking back at them, which is why it's a relief that there were some more simple items to balance them out. Items like Big Stick, 60 gold to add 3 damage. There were also a lot more options when it came to swords. You could choose between short sword, long sword, broadsword, and of course BF sword. But if you're still a fan of sticks and you want a slightly fancier stick, you could try out Zettas Mana Stick. For 1270 gold, you get 180 mana, 12 spell damage, and 3 mana regen per second. It also had 4 charges of gain 250 mana. Mana in general used to be a far more valuable resource. These days, there's an abundance of manaless champions, and mana in general is a lot simpler to manage. Even when League wasn't in alpha anymore, you could actually still run out of mana fairly quickly if you didn't manage it properly, at least in the early days. Which brings us to our next item. Thoughtbreaker was a 1335 gold item that added 15 damage and 30% attack speed. However, it also had a passive that let you attack your opponent's mana bar. Every hit you landed, you'd burn up to 22 of your opponent's mana, dealing 100% hit point damage. But Thoughtbreaker wasn't the only item with this effect though. It was also a part of an item that you might recognize from today, Wits End. It added 32 damage, 30% increased attack speed, and a mana burn that burnt up to 40 mana per hit, dealing 100% hit point damage, and it gave the bearer the mana break ability which dealt 5 damage per 1% mana missing. Wits End actually made it through to Season 1 with the mana burn effect, but it got reworked towards the end of the season in 2011, the same patch that Vayne was released. I know I've ragged on items a lot like Big Stick and Knife, but there were a lot of similar items that didn't cost very much and usually gave some small benefits. Elementium Threaded Cloak cost 375 gold and gave 25 spell block, and that was literally the whole item. Composite Bow was a 650 gold item that increased your attack damage by 14 and had a 20% chance to deal 50 extra damage, unaffected by armor. This also extended into a bunch of smaller potions or knickknacks that you could buy to temporarily buff yourself. These days, you just have the big 3 potions to buff either attack damage or spell damage or tankiness, but at least in pre-alpha, that wasn't really the case. Arcane Protection Potion would absorb up to 200 magic damage. It lasted 40 seconds and would only set you back 40 gold. Scroll of Speed increased your movement speed by 10 for 60 seconds. Tome of Combat Mastery gave you a 10% greater chance to crit for 60 seconds. Renewal Tunic gave 3 armor and 2 health regen. Bag of Tea cost 75 gold and was an activatable 3 seconds silence. Sharpening Stone increased physical damage dealt by 30 for 60 seconds. Tome of Minor Necrocompulsion raised a nearby dead unit to fight for the user for 60 seconds. And of course, apart from the regular healing potions, you could buy a literal healing totem and place it down for 100 gold. It'd restore 1% HP per second to nearby allies and lasted for 30 seconds. Berserkers Greaves were also a little bit funky. Obviously these days they're the attack speed boots more or less, but when you look at their old functionality it becomes a little bit more obvious where the Berserker part of the name originates from. In pre-alpha, they gave 40 movement speed, 20 damage, 6% increased critical strike rate, and an activatable Berserk that increased movement speed by 15 and attack speed by 75% for 10 seconds, but you also take 20% increased damage. It would also cost you 50 mana and it had a 60-second cooldown. Diving into some bigger items, let's start with Dawnseeker. It was another item that took advantage of the day-night cycle that existed in the game at the time. It added 14 damage, 6% increased crit strike rate, 35 increased attack speed during the day, and a 100% chance, yes 100%, to blind the target on hit during the day, giving it a 20% miss chance. Disruption Rod was an old hybrid item. These sorts of items used to be a lot more common in Old League, and it looks like pre-alpha was no exception. It built out a Blasting Band and Longsword, Blasting Band being another old-time item, and it gave 32 spell damage, 24 damage, 350 hit points, and a 20% chance on hit and on spell hit to reduce the target's armor by 4 and spell block by 35% for 15 seconds. Igaitai Twin Soul, I think that's how you say that name, was a pretty interesting item because it uses an old debuff that isn't available on any items these days. For 2,750 gold, you'd get plus 50 damage, 50% attack speed, and a 20% chance to curse the enemy on hit. The only other place in League these days where curse is mentioned is Amumu's passive. In the case of this item, Igaitai Twin Soul, it would increase the enemy's damage taken by 20% for 40 seconds. Flash Render is another item that shows another debuff that has since disappeared. The item itself adds 35 damage, 20% increased attack rate, 400 hit points, and 8 charges of Hamstring. You might remember we mentioned Hamstring already in Sheen and Phage, and interestingly it has a different effect here. On Flesh Render, it reduces movement speed and attack speed by 75% for 4 seconds. It cost 0 mana, had a 15-second cooldown, and 150 range. If you remember back to Sheen and Phage, the effect was to reduce armor by 5 and movement speed by 35%, despite having the same Hamstring debuff. This also isn't the only place that this debuff appears. You can also find it on Phage and Phage and Zeal, where the effects seem to mirror the armor and move speed debuff that's on Flesh Render. It's a little bit hard to know whether the active on Flesh Render ever made it into any more playable states of the game, because having what is essentially 8 stacks of exhaust on steroids as part of an item with a 15-second cooldown seems way too strong. And honestly, it's a good contender for one of the strongest items on this list that we've seen so far. You might remember Gale Force as an item that existed between Season 10 and Season 14, but there was actually a version of it in Pre-Alpha 2. It gave 75 damage and had a 15% chance to knock the target back 60 distance on hit. It also dealt 120 bonus damage on hit if the target was a non-structure. Glacial Shroud is an item that you probably know. It gives mana and armor and also builds into these items. But it used to be a full item that cost 2670 gold and did a whole lot more. It gave 8 armor, 4.5 health regen per second, 225 mana, 15% CDR on all cooldowns, and an activatable ice barricade that made the user unable to take any actions for 8 seconds. But during this duration, they were invulnerable. Sort of like a huge version of Zonya's, with the exception being you could activate the ability again to break out of the stasis whenever you chose. It also cost 200 mana to use. Gladiator's Pride was a 2,165 gold item that added 35 damage, 6 armor, and returned a whopping 25% of damage to the attacker if they were melee. It also had an activatable taunt, which forced a single target to attack the bearer for 3 seconds. This had 100 range, 50 mana cost, and a 30-second cooldown. Guardian Angel was in the game at this point, but it didn't have its revive passive yet. It added 10 armor, 600 hit points, 6 health regen per second, and its passive was a 15% chance on being hit to heal friendly units within a 200 radius for 150. This was capped at a maximum of 1 proc per 1.5 seconds. Something that you would have probably noticed so far is that a lot of these items opened up the possibilities for alternative playstyles. Putting things like taunts and silences on items to be used as actives allowed champions to deviate from their usual playstyles, even if the deviated playstyle wasn't as good as the typical build path. AP Master Yi or AP Tristana are both pretty good examples of this. From a raw statistical standpoint, they aren't as strong as the AD builds, but the alternative is still there as an option just in case you want it. Speaking of items with weird actives, what if we tried putting a baby Mordekaiser ult on an item? Gwynsu's Rod of Oblivion cost 3070 gold. It gave 400 mana, 30 spell damage, 2.2 mana regen, and an activatable ability called Oblivion. Oblivion banished an enemy to the Netherrealm for 4 seconds, where they could take no actions but they became invulnerable. Upon returning to the physical realm, they were stunned for 1 second. This cost 150 mana, it had 200 range, and a 25 second cooldown. This definitely seems like it could have been the inspiration for the current Mordekaiser ult that we have today. This item was named after one of League's original developers, Steve Gwynsu Feek, who was also one of the creators of the original Dota All-Stars mod. Rod of Oblivion didn't make it into the final game, but obviously Gwynsu's Rageblade did. This item built out of 2 other items that we also haven't spoken about yet. Brilliant Circle of the Magi, a 1200 gold item that gave 24 spell damage and 240 mana, and Pablito's Wand of Humility, an item with a slightly questionable description. Pablito's Wand of Humility cost 1540 gold, and it gave 100 health, 125 mana, and 2.2 mana regen per second, and 7 charges of an activatable Tarkomorph. Tarkomorph would turn an enemy unit into a Tarko for 3 seconds where it can take no actions. It only had a 12 second cooldown, no mana cost, and 200 range. Alright, so at this point we've made a lot of progress through the items, but now we're going to get into some of the bigger, more expensive ones. Inferno's Justice was a 3300 gold item. It gave 30 damage, 45% increased attack speed, and your attacks had a 20% chance on attack to deal 180 bonus fire damage in a 100 area of effect. Additionally, every time you got a kill, it would deal 300 damage in a 400 radius. Infinity Edge has existed in League since pre-alpha, but it did used to work differently. It would set you back 3,565 gold, and it added 110 damage and increase your critical strike by 5%, and it would further multiply your crit chance by an additional 50%. So basically, if you had 20% crit chance, this passive would raise it to 30%. Innovating Locket is one of the most notoriously broken items in League of Legends history, and it's also existed since the pre-alpha, but back then it was quite different. The broken version that got removed in Season 1 because someone bought it in an official show match and stomped too hard would give regen every time you used an ability. This ended up meaning that champions like Udyr and Sona could spam their abilities and take advantage of this way too effectively. In pre-alpha, it would set you back 3000 gold, and it gave 35 spell damage, 450 hit points, 450 mana, and an activatable refresh that reset all of your cooldowns except for the item itself. This active cost 200 mana and had a 150 second cooldown. Cardel's Aim was another unique item. It doesn't seem like it built into anything, at least that I could find from these records, but for 1550 gold you get 24 damage, 15% increased attack speed, and a 30% chance on hit to deal 50 bonus damage and passively increase your attack range by 40. It doesn't specify in the description how long this effect lasts for, but it's probably safe to assume it's somewhere between 1 second and the end of the game. Kenyu's Kukri. There is literally nothing about this item aside from the fact that it cost 1235 gold and it existed at some point. Last Whisper. It's a classic item and one that still exists in the game today. Back in 2008, it hadn't active though, like a lot of items did, honestly. It actually seems like if there was an ability in the game at all, there was probably also an activatable version of it slapped onto an item, which, I mean, look, does seem pretty cool in theory at least. Last Whisper cost 2160 gold and it gave 20 damage, 40% attack speed, and an activatable Vanish that gave the user invisibility for 9 seconds. It cost 75 mana and only had a 25 second cooldown. This does seem pretty busted on paper, but stealth in general used to be a lot crazier in the old days of League. Obviously these days, if you walk too close to someone while you're in stealth while playing Evelynn, for example, you'll get detected. But in Season 1, her invisibility was permanent until you took an action to break it, like attacking. This is where the stories about Evelynn buying 6 Sunfire Capes and burning you to death while you can't do anything about it come from. There was a 2350 gold item that was literally just called Mechanism. It gave 250 mana and an aura that regenerated 1.5 mana per second and 3 health per second to nearby units. On top of that, it gave 30% bonus healing and an activatable Mechanism heal, which restored 250 health to friendly units within the aura range. Megaton Mallet was likely an early prototype of Frozen Mallet. This was a deduction made using my excellent analytical skills, but also mostly because they just have the same picture. It cost 2300 gold and gave 50 damage and an 18% on hit to apply Crush. Crush would stun the target for 1.25 seconds and deal 50 bonus damage, but it would only work if the target was a melee champion. You also couldn't stack it with Skull Crusher, which is an item that we'll get to soon. Medjai's Soulstealer has always had some sort of stacking element to it, but if we've learned one thing from traveling back to look at these old items, it's that everything deserves its own active ability. Medjai's would give 30 spell damage and 300 mana, but it also had a clickable Soulsteal ability, which dealt 350 damage to a target. Each hero kill would increase the Medjai's Soulstealer spell damage by a flat 10. It's not explicitly stated if this had a cap on the amount of stacks that you can get, but judging by how wild all the other items on this list are, it probably didn't. Nether Rift Armor gave 6 armor, 45 spell block, and a friendly aura that increased mana regen by 2 within 200 units. It also had a, and I quote, unfriendly aura. This mean aura damaged enemy spellcasters within 250 range whenever they cast a spell for 100% of the mana cost with a cooldown of 4 seconds. Phantom Dancer, another classic item. It cost 3070 gold, gave 45 damage, and 20% increased crit chance and a 25 increased dodge rate. If you're an early player of League, you probably remember when dodge was a stat. If you haven't heard of this before, it's essentially exactly what it sounds like. It just gives a percentage chance to dodge the attack altogether, but we'll touch on it more a bit later. Phase Striders were an old brute option that, of course, had an active. For 1250 gold, you get 40 movement speed, but also an activatable blink, which could teleport you up to 400 distance. Using this ability cost you 75 mana and it had a 30-second cooldown. Spirit Visage built out of Longsword and Elementium Threaded Cloak. It gave 6 armor, 25 damage, and 320 life. This item also lets you cast Mirror Form, which creates one clone of the caster and damage is shared between the two equally. The clone deals 60% damage and it takes 100%. This cost 75 mana and had a 50-second cooldown and a 20-second duration. There's also not anything saying that items like these or like Doppleganker were unique, but if there is a rider out there, please I need some footage of everyone building these items and the map being overrun by 100 clones at once. Stark's Fervor. If you're an old school player, you probably remember this item. In pre-alpha, it added 5 crit chance and gave 15% lifesteal and 35% increased attack speed. But this version of the item had a clickable active that buffed your AoE aura by adding 25% damage and 15% movement speed to friendly units for 15 seconds. Sunfire Cape. This item in pre-alpha gave you crit strike, 30% increased attack speed, and it still had its passive burning effect which dealt 45 damage per second in a 120 radius. However, this item also had an interesting mechanic where you could upgrade it up to 2 more times by purchasing the combined cost again. If we have a look at the cost of its components, which is 1200 for Sleek Wrap and 420 for Brawler's Glove, so 1620 all up. Sunfire Cape cost 2120, so the combined / upgrade cost was. Every time you upgraded this, you get an additional 6 damage and 5% attack speed, and the burning effect was upgraded by 15 damage per second. Sword of Light and Shadow is probably one of the coolest items on this list, at least in my opinion, and it's another one that takes advantage of the day and night cycle. In general, it gave 30 damage, 25 attack speed, and 8% crit chance. At night, it granted 18% increased move speed and a 100% chance on hit to absorb life from the target. During the day, it grants a 50% increased attack rate and a 100% chance on hit to blind the target, increasing its chance to miss by 28%. Absolutely no clue what it built out of or what its price was. Most of you will know this item, but in the pre-alpha it was a full item and not just a component like it is today. In fact, it was actually one of the most expensive items on this list. It gave 600 HP, 400 mana, 6 health per second regen, and 2 mana per second regen. It also had an activatable spell reflect ability which reflected the next single target spell cast upon this target. Maybe this reminds you of someone.
Now, the spell reflects projectiles back against their source.
The more that we go through these items, the more mechanics pop up that have been reused on champions in the past 2 years. This spell reflection was received with pretty mixed reactions when Mel first came out, but it's actually something that was tested first in pre-alpha. Something like Briar's Self-Taunt had a similar reaction, but that was part of the item Leeroys Charge. But moving on. The Black Cleaver. This iteration of the item gave 50 damage and lowered the target's armor by 2 per hit, and it was stackable up to 6 times and renewable on hit. The main thing to notice here is that these weren't unique, and remained that way for quite some time. Some of you might remember the infamous Black Cleaver patch where most games looked something like this. Bloodthirster added 60 damage, 20% lifesteal, and each time you killed a unit you'd get a stack which increased the damage and lifesteal even further. This would cap at a whopping 140 damage and 40% lifesteal, but you'd lose half the stacks upon dying. Verdant Force was a 1600 gold item that gave 550 HP and some health regen, and a 100% chance on kill to restore 25 health. Thornmail was in the game, but it was a component rather than a full item. It cost 700 gold and gave 6 armor and returned 20 damage to an attacker. It was also a component for Gladiator's Pride, which is an item that we touched on before. Thresher's Wrath gave 50 damage, some health regen, some mana regen, and a 30% cleave attack which only worked on melees. If you're thinking this item sounds a little bit similar to Tiamat, then boy do I have the item for you. Tiamat used to be a full item rather than a component like it is today. It cost 3180 gold and gave 80 damage, some health, some mana regen, and a 45% cleave that extended into a shockwave. It built out a Thresher's Wrath and a broadsword. Trinity Force has also been in the game since pre-alpha as well. Funnily enough, this item has always built out of Phage, Sheen, and Zeal, however the effects that it gave were slightly different due to its components at the time also having different effects. For example, since Sheen used to give a heal rather than doing bonus damage, the effect on Triforce was that whenever the bearer casts a spell, he's healed for 25% of the spell's mana cost. Vindicator's Embrace is an item that we don't really have a lot of information on, but it gave 200 health, 6 armor, and a 25% chance on taking damage to prevent some of that damage and returning it to the attacker. Warmogs used to be called Warmog's Living Armor. It's always acted as the huge health item, even back in 2008. This initial iteration gave 1100 hit points and 11 hit points regen per second. Each time you got a minion kill, it'd stack the HP and HP regen even further. Widowmaker, not the Overwatch champion, added 80% increased attack rate, 10% increased crit rate, and a 100% chance on crit to leave a dot on the target, dealing 150 damage over 3 seconds. Wraithfire Crossbow was a component of Inferno's Justice, another item that we previously mentioned. It gave 35 damage and a 20% chance on hit to deal 130 bonus fire damage in an 80 area of effect. Zeal was also part of the pre-alpha, but there was also Zeal and Sheen. Zhonya's Ring is an item that you might remember if you played in early Season 1. Back then, it was an item that combined the effects of Zhonya's Hourglass and Deathcap's AP passive into the one item. Before this though, it behaved a little bit differently. It gave 300 mana, 75 spell damage, and an activatable called Mind Dream, which dealt 175 damage per second to a target for up to 3 seconds and also silenced it. This cost 100 mana and had a 30-second cooldown and a 0.25 spell damage ratio. There's no footage of this, much like many of the other items, but it sounds really similar to Mauser Hole, to be honest, and that's probably what it got turned into. Avarice Blade was an 850 gold item that gave 20 damage and a passive called Greed, which would instantly kill the next minion you attacked and give you a bonus 3 bounty from it. Now, there were a lot of little component items that are sort of interesting. Fairy Charm, Meki Pendant, Rejuvenation Bead. Mighty Waistband of the Reaver was a slightly bigger one that gave damage and health. Cloak of Agility used to give attack speed as well as crit strike. Glowing Orb only cost 80 gold and it just gave some health and mana. Ancestral Pendant, Byfire Bracer, Blasting Band, Sapphire Sphere and Ruby Sphere, which seem to be the old names for Sapphire and Ruby Crystal. They also built into Prismatic Sphere, which, although there is Catalyst the Protector in this version of the game, Prismatic Sphere is a bit closer to what Catalyst actually is today. Mana Manipulator gave you a friendly aura that increased mana regen for nearby allied units. It also had a negative aura that decreased mana regen for nearby enemies. Cloth Armor and Chain Vest were also both available, although they were both also a lot cheaper. Steel Stiletto was an item that gave 40% attack speed, and it bears a bit of resemblance to Dagger. Brawler's Gloves gave damage and crit. Boom's Guardian Armor gave armor, mana, and CDR. Elementium Woven Mantle gave health and spell block. Harmony Ring gave spell damage and a lot of mana regen. Scepter of Death gave damage and lifesteal. Warden's Mail gave armor, health, and health regen. Soul Pendant gave some regen, and Soul Shroud was also in the game as a 520 gold item, although its effects at this point were unknown. Wards were also in the game at this point, except they used to be called Eye of the Beholder, which is actually a pretty fitting name. Exquisite Candy was an item that cost 150 gold and would increase your spell damage by 65 for 60 seconds. There were also some pretty big buffing potions. Potion of Giant Strength increased hit points by 350, damage dealt by 20, armor by 8, and spell block by 20. It lasted up to 5 minutes and persisted through death. There were also its counterparts, Potion of Elusiveness and Potion of Brilliance. Eagle Strike gave 26 damage and had a 20% chance to deal 80 bonus damage on hit. Abyssal Scepter, another old league item that eventually got morphed into Abyssal Mask, was around in pre-alpha. It cost 3250 gold and added 50 spell damage but also 24 attack damage, alongside 400 HP, 150 mana, and an aura that gave -5 armor and -45 spell block to enemies within a 200 range. Assault Treads were another alternative boot choice that gave 40 movement speed, 10 damage, and 4% crit chance, something there isn't really an equivalent to in today's version of League. Ahrimans Impaler was also in the game at this point. It gave 60 damage, 5% crit, 300 health, and converted 4% of the bearer's current hit points into damage. Boots of Swiftness were exactly what the name suggested, although they gave a little bit less move speed than what they currently do, and they also didn't have the slow resist passive. Frozen Heart used to give some damage and attack speed along with its tankiness, and also a passive that slowed the enemy's movement and attack speed by 25%. Rallying Banner was an item that gave attack speed and lifesteal aura to nearby units, and a clickable AoE buff called Morale Boost. Morale Boost added an extra 20% damage to the buff for 15 seconds. Reverb Coil was another interesting item. It gave spell damage and mana regen, but it also had an activatable called Echo. Echo would light up after you cast a non-ultimate, non-item spell, and for the next 5 seconds you could cast a duplicate of that spell for twice its mana cost. Shadow's Ire was an item that honestly looks complex enough to be added into Modern League. It gave damage, attack speed, and health, plus an attack enchantment that whenever the bearer attacked another unit, that unit would gain open wounds. Open wounds made it so they would take an extra 9 damage from each attack. It also had an active called Split, which would create 2 images of yourself which took 200% damage and dealt 40%. That would last for 20 seconds each. Cinderin Shielding Amulet gave spell block, hit points, and mana, but the more interesting part of it is its active. It made the caster immune to all magic spells for the next 10 seconds, with a 75-second cooldown and 100 mana cost. Sorcerer's Shoes were also in the game, but rather than giving magic pen, they just gave flat spell damage. Orb of Intellect was a minor item that gave some spell damage, health, and 80 mana. Its AD counterpart was Orb of Valor. And finally, we have Skull Crusher. Skull Crusher was the main component of Megaton Mallet, if you remember that item. It had the same Crush passive, which had a 12% chance to stun the enemy for 1.25 seconds on hit and deal bonus damage. It's fairly obvious why, even this early on in the game, they decided not to make this stackable, because with 6 of these, you could be running around with a 72% chance for your basic attacks to stun for more than a second. If you stacked 6 Megaton Mallets instead, this chance went up even further to 108%, guaranteeing that your opponent would never move again. Alright, thanks for watching, that's pretty much it. Subscribe, bye.